his BS in Systems Engineering from the United States Military Academy at West Point. He is a speaker, writer, podcaster, and former Army captain. He is the former executive director and founder of Health Freedom for Humanity and is the founder of The Way Forward. And fun, frivolous fact is that he was actually kicked out of this convention center 2 years ago. So he's going to tell you a little bit more about that during his talk. Please help me welcome Alec Zeck.
Okay, let me get situated here. So, yes, 2 years ago I was kicked out of this convention center for an event that I held called the Health Freedom for Humanity Symposium. And the good news of that story is that, so we were kicked out because we violated the mask ordinance, but we had already had a verbal agreement with the city of Kansas City, who owns this building, that if the mask mandates come back, we're not going to follow it. So we had already made that verbal agreement. After day one of our event, 650 attendees, 25 plus speakers, exhibitors all over the place, we were kicked out. And then the next day, we showed health freedom in action by that little area up there on the stairs. We held an event outside on day two, and it ended up being better. And then fast forward a few weeks, we held the city of Kansas City accountable, and they paid us back in damages, showing that you actually can fight this tyranny. So it's a pretty full circle experience being here, like almost 2 years to the date. Okay, so this talk is called Reframing the Infectious Disease Paradigm. You're going to want to pay attention. Who here, let me see this. Who here thinks that SARS-CoV-2, and be honest, please be honest, came from a lab, that there's a bioweapon that leaked from a lab? That's what I like to see. If no one raised their hand, I'd just leave. Just go. Okay. Okay. So according to the CDC's own data on COVID, 95% of COVID deaths had an average of 4 comorbidities, most being lifestyle or nutrition related. 79% of hospitalizations were in overweight or obese people. And then this study that was published in part by the CDC in July of 2021, looking at 540,000 people who had been labeled as a COVID death, and I'll get to why I have COVID deaths or COVID anything in air quotes, found that the second strongest risk factor for death associated with COVID was fear/anxiety related disorders. Who knew about that? A lot of people. Okay, fear/anxiety related disorders was the second strongest risk factor for death associated with COVID. Think about that. That implies those are people who had already had a diagnosed fear/anxiety related disorder. So that wouldn't account for the large number of people, I'd imagine, who were in a perpetual state of fear, who wound up in the hospital, wound up being put on remdesivir, ventilator, et cetera, et cetera. So fear plays a huge role in what happened over the last 3.5 years, and even people who were not scared of the virus or anything like that, you might have been a little bit fearful of government tyranny, fearful of uncertain about the future. I know I was at various points in time, so it impacted all of us on some level. So these are two questions to ponder. What happens when we're conditioned to believe in a totally unproven, fear-based paradigm? What happens when we're conditioned to believe in an invisible, deadly boogeyman, something that could be anywhere and anyone but can't be seen with the naked eye? Think about that. What happens when we're conditioned to believe that? Okay, I'm going to skip that because I don't want you to see, actually. I should have taken that one out. Okay, thought experiment. Does Santa Claus exist? Does Santa Claus exist? No. But what about all the pictures, the videos, the decorations, the piece of beard I find in the fireplace on Christmas morning, the presents under the tree? All of my friends that think that he exists, like it's the best fit model that we have to give evidence to Santa Claus existing. But does Santa Claus actually exist? No, and we know that as adults. So it's time for us to stop being children when it comes to this too, and I'll get to how this relates to what I'm talking about today. So all the evidence points to Santa Claus existing, right? Best fit model, but Santa Claus doesn't exist, right? Okay, this comes from, I don't know if Tom's still in the room. I think he left. He's heard this a gazillion times. But this comes from Dr. Cowan in Sally Fowler-Morell's book, The Contagion Myth. It's a little analogy or thought experiment. So if I were to tell you that a ping pong ball could break through a brick wall, logically speaking, you'd want to see evidence of that, right? So the first thing that I do is I pour a bunch of corrosive acid all over the brick wall. And then I take a giant mallet and smash the brick wall several times. And then I tape the ping pong ball to a giant boulder and whirl it at the brick wall, and the brick wall falls down. Voila! Right? I have proven that the ping pong ball caused the destruction of that brick wall, right? No, of course not. Actually, it's someone, when I gave this talk a while back, be like, yes. I'm like, no, absolutely not. Ping pong. That's powerful ping pong ball. But no, absolutely not, right? Of course, it was all of the other things in the experiment that caused the brick wall to fall down, the corrosive acid, et cetera, et cetera. So if I were to tell you that SARS-CoV-2, or insert any other virus, has not been isolated or proven to exist, I'm sure a lot of you by now have heard this. You've got to have been under a rock if you're in the freedom movement and you hadn't heard this a little bit by now. If I were to tell you that it had never been proven to exist, you'd either say, well, how do you explain symptoms, and we'll get to that, or you'd say, well, I'm going to go ask one of my buddies that's an MD or that's a molecular biologist, or I'm going to go look on PubMed or Google Scholar. And you'd find a paper that looks just like this, and it says in the title, Isolation and Rapid Sharing of the 2019 Novel Coronavirus SARS-CoV-2 from the first patient diagnosed with COVID-19 in Australia. And you'd find thousands and thousands of papers that look identical to this one, send it to me and be like, what the hell are you talking about? You're a crazy conspiracy theorist. I'm not listening to anything you say thereafter. Here's the problem, though. This is what the overwhelming majority, and it is the overwhelming majority of the world, knows isolation to mean. To separate from another substance to obtain in a pure or free state, right? That's what we know isolation to mean. And if you read the methods section, which describes the procedure of the experiment of that paper or any other virus isolation paper, you will find that it describes a process that has nothing whatsoever to do with isolation. So it essentially goes like this. They take snot from a sick person or other fluids from a sick person assumed to contain a virus. They then add that snot to what's called viral transport medium. In viral transport medium, depending on the company, contains at a minimum amphotericin B and gentamicin. So they're adding this snot that is assumed, that's the key point here, to contain a virus, to viral transport medium, right? Viral transport medium contains amphotericin B, gentamicin, some other substances, salt-based solutions. That mixture is then added to a foreign cell culture consisting of typically monkey kidney cells coming from an adult green monkey, okay? They then add Delbecco's minimal essential medium or Earl's minimal essential medium or Delbecco's modified eagle medium, which are essentially food sources for the cell. They then will add trypsin sometimes they won't, and trypsin breaks down proteins. They'll then add more gentamicin and more amphotericin B. They'll then add penicillin, streptomycin, and then they'll add fetal bovine serum, which is another food source for the cell. The cell experiences what's called the cytopathic effect, or the cells experience a cytopathic effect, where they break down into a bunch of fragments after they've had all this stuff added to it with, again, fluid from a sick person assumed to contain a virus, right? After the cell experiences the cells experience the cytopathic effect, they then collect the sample and prepare it for electron microscopy. Electron micrograph images are produced, and then they point to the particles on the images and say, these are viruses. So how does that relate to what I just described with the ping pong ball and the brick wall? Anyone? How old are you? You're 11. Yeah, this is amazing. Yeah. How come she's the first one to answer? You guys are all so conditioned. Yes, correct. They break down the brick wall before they even insert the ping pong ball. They add all the other stuff, right? All the other stuff is added to the monkey kidney cell, and then snot assumed to contain a virus, but never verified. They're poisoning the cell. They're starving the cell, because actually, when it comes to fetal bovine serum, or sometimes Delbecco's minimal essential medium, they'll reduce the nutrient intake when they add the sample from a sick person. So they're starving the cells and poisoning the cells. We're going to get into details on how they poison the cells, but first, I want to cover this. So there's three major branches of science. This is where science kind of becomes self-refuting. So for today, though, we're going to focus on natural science. So natural science is the study of natural phenomena, right? It's literally just the study of natural phenomena. And when looking at the three branches of science, this is where science is self-refuting, the only branch of science that employs the scientific method is natural science. So you're simply trying to ascertain what causes an observed natural phenomenon, right? So you see something happening in nature, you're trying to figure out what causes that phenomenon, right? So the scientific method, we all learned this in grade school. You've probably learned this, right? So, a little bit by now? Okay, scientific method. A method of discovering knowledge about the natural world. Okay, so here's the steps of the scientific method. Observe a natural phenomenon, right? And you formulate a hypothesis. And in the case of this, it might be my observed natural phenomenon is two or more people getting sick in the same space with similar symptoms. That's an observed natural phenomenon, right? So then you develop a hypothesis, which is a proposed explanation for the phenomenon, right? In this case, it might be, I think a particle in the fluids of these people is causing them to become sick, right? That might be your hypothesis. Good. In order to proceed to experimentation, you need to have the thing you think is causing that phenomenon by itself to vary and manipulate to see if it produces the effect that you are seeing. You guys following what I'm saying there? You need to have the thing you think is the cause by itself completely to then see if it produces the effect. People getting sick in this case, right? Okay, you guys get that? Get that? Again, to reiterate, the thing you think is the cause of the observed phenomenon is the independent variable. You're varying and manipulating that to see if it produces the effect, the observed natural phenomenon, or the dependent variable. So, it might be the particles from the fluids. But the problem is, with virology, is they have never, ever, 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 ever in the history of virology taken particles directly from the fluids of a sick person, ever, without first combining the fluids with other sources of genetic material like I described in that experiment. So they assume the virus is in the fluids without ever verifying it. They assume the virus has an effect. The cell culture obviously contains too many confounding variables. They proceed to experimentation, which would be the next step in the scientific method, without ever having the independent variable, the thing they think is the cause, the most important piece. They don't have it, and they already proceed to this, add a bunch of other stuff to the cell culture, and then it produces an effect. And then the other problem with that is there's no proper control experiments conducted, and I'll get to that in a minute. So virology does not adhere to the scientific method. And we've gone through back and forth with virologists and molecular biologists, myself, Mike Stone, Dr. Tom Cowan, Dr. Andy Kaufman, sending them this like a screenshot of the scientific method, and we say, what's that? And they say, oh yeah, it's the scientific method. I'm like, okay, can you show me one paper in modern virology where they do that? They'll send one of the viral isolation papers that I just showed, and I'm like, no. You proceeded to that step without ever having the thing. And they're like, well, what? You don't agree with all of cell biology then? I'm like, yeah, you're right. I don't agree with all of cell biology. Okay, so pseudoscience consists of, and there's multiple definitions for this, is essentially anything that is claiming to be scientific while failing to adhere to the scientific method. Virology, because they do not have an independent variable and they do not conduct proper control experiments, is by definition, by their own definition, pseudoscience. So it's funny they call all of us, you believe in pseudoscience, and the very foundation of everything that happened over the last 3.5 years, the entire vaccine program, all of it, is based in this. By definition, pseudoscience. Yeah, doublespeak. Yeah, exactly. Are you guys following along with what I'm saying so far? Okay. Actually, I know we don't have time for questions. If you have a question pertaining to the slide, not about what causes illness, if it's pertaining to the slide, please raise your hand and I'll try to answer it. So a scientific theory is an explanation of the aspect of the natural world and universe that has been repeatedly tested and corroborated in accordance with the scientific method. So is it really germ theory? And again, we're not going to go into bacteria today, but this also applies to bacteria too, as crazy as that sounds. So is the germ theory really a theory? Has it been repeatedly tested and corroborated in accordance with the scientific method? No. It's the germ hypothesis. Yes?
You're saying that they've never taken bacteria?
In an isolated form and shown that it causes illness in a healthy person. Correct. That is true. I know that's mind-blowing. I have a whole series that I made on this that... Who watched the end of COVID? Anyone in here? There's a lot more people that need to. Katie, do you have the flyers to pass out?
They've isolated bacteria.
Yes, they have isolated bacteria. Bacteria absolutely exist. Yes, correct.
In a healthy person.
In a healthy person. Yeah, correct.
Most people aren't healthy.
That's true. That's true. Exactly. And who understands pleomorphism in here? That is something that you need to understand. It's really cool, actually. Okay. Can we do a scientific experiment on Santa Claus? No, we can't, because you have to first have Santa Claus, right, in order to conduct a scientific experiment on him, right? Right? Okay, so we cannot conduct a scientific experiment on Santa Claus. So this comes from a quote from Dr. Stefan Lanka. He's a German virologist, or he'll say former virologist because virology is not a true field. In every single photograph of a virus, you will find that it's from a cell culture, but never from the blood, never from the saliva, never from the semen, never from another liquid of the body, not from a human, not from an animal, not from a plant. Every single one of these images that you see shown all over the news, and scientists and doctors talk about them, every single one comes from the experiment that I just described. Never, ever, ever has there been a virus imaged in the fluids of a sick person. Ever. Is that mind-blowing? Right? That's crazy, right? It's crazy to me. Okay, one more time back to the ping pong ball and the brick wall analogy. So I'm going to take it a step further than Dr. Cowan and Sally did in their book, in that the ping pong ball, you know, is actually there. It's there in the experiment, so you could make argument. It'd be ridiculous. You could make an argument that it caused the brick wall to fall down because you actually have the ping pong ball. With viruses, they don't even know that they're in the fluids of a sick person. It is literally an assumed theoretical thing. Completely an assumption. They don't even know that it's actually there. And then they proceed to do all these things that I just described a second ago. Okay, so when I was going through a lot of cognitive dissonance when I first learned this stuff, and I'm like, dang, like there's got to be an explanation for this. Like, okay, I'm going to ask some virologists that I find why viruses cannot be isolated directly from the fluids of a sick person without being combined with other sources of genetic material and other toxins, et cetera, et cetera. And when you ask a virologist or a molecular biologist this, they'll say the virus is too weak to isolate or purify directly from the fluids. And I thought about that. I'm like, too weak? A thing that lands on a surface, survives on a surface for upwards of 2 to 3 days, makes it all the way to a body, makes it to a cell, breaks into the cell, hijacks the cell's machinery, begins a replication process that overwhelms the body. It's excreted out of that person where it repeats the same process over. But then it's too weak to isolate directly from the fluids? So it does all of those things. Sounds pretty strong to me, but then you can't isolate it directly from the fluids of a sick person? Does that make any sense? No. Okay. And then they'll say that there's not enough virus present in the fluids to isolate or purify it. What's a high viral load? Or like, isn't this supposed to be a submicroscopic particle that's extremely deadly? There's not enough of it in the fluids to isolate or purify? And Dr. Cowan and Andy Kaufman have talked about this, where they've asked the virologist, okay, what if I mashed up the fluids of 10 people? Would there be enough virus in that case? And he's like, no. Okay, what about 100 people? Fluid from 100 people. Would there be enough virus particles there? No. 1,000? No. 10,000? No. And then the guy just stopped answering. That doesn't make any sense, right? A virus needs a host in order to replicate, so that's why we use the cell culture. This logic is absurd to me because, again, if the virus is in the fluids of a sick person, you should be able to find it directly in the fluids of a sick person without combining it with other sources of genetic material and other toxins and things like this. And then the last one is you're not a virologist. You don't get to determine what isolation is. Yeah, that's a funny one. Okay, so other components of cell culture media. So we're going to get into detail on some of the things that they add. So I know we're not supposed to be using our phones. We see all of you. Look at all of you millennials. Actually, it's a bunch of older people that are using their phones. I don't want to assume your age, but not on her phone. Look at her. Just paying attention. If you could, though, I want someone to type in on Google or DuckDuckGo. They're both compromised at this point. But type in amphotericin B, toxic kidneys, and you tell me. Someone shout it out. You tell me what you find when you type in amphotericin B, toxic kidneys. Because you will find that amphotericin B is known to be cytotoxic to kidneys specifically. It is known to cause renal failure. Penicillin streptomycin, it's there to prevent bacterial growth in the culture. There's a reason that they add these things, right? And you can see those listed. Gentamicin, it can cause kidney damage as well. You look up gentamicin, toxic kidneys, and you will find the same thing. Hepes, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. It's hepes, I don't know. But trypsin is the other big one that they add a lot of time. There's actually... There is a virus isolation study, and this is just the absurd logic that they do, where they first did not add trypsin, right? They did all the things, but they did not add trypsin. And then when the cells experienced a cytopathic effect, there was no characteristic spike protein. So they went back, and then they added trypsin, and trypsin breaks down proteins, and then the cytopathic effect was produced, and then they were like, oh, voila, now it's SARS-CoV-2. We got it. We got the right virus. What? Makes no sense. Did anyone find any results? Did anyone Google it?
How can anybody get the right virus?
That's
There's no virus.
she already got it. You want to come give this talk? Come on. She must be homeschooled. You homeschool her? Of course. Of course.
It says acute kidney injury is a relatively common complication of amphotericin B.
Acute kidney injury is a relatively common complication of amphotericin B. So let's think about this again. What are they adding this to? A monkey kidney cell. And they're assuming that it has no effect except for to keep the culture sterile and free of fungal growth, and then for gentamicin or geneticin, free of bacterial growth. They assume that, and I get where they're coming from, right? I don't think all virologists are in on this grand scheme. It's just that they've been taught this method to isolate, and they don't know better. It's when you're taught something as fact and it's repetitive and it's shared with you like this is how we isolate viruses, this is what we do. But they overlook this because amphotericin B, just as she said, is known to be cytotoxic to kidneys. And they're adding it to a monkey kidney cell, assuming that it has no effect on the culture except for to keep it free of fungal growth. Same with gentamicin or geneticin. So this study... our results indicate that the use of amphotericin B may facilitate influenza virus isolation and production in vero cells. In other words, amphotericin B is very toxic, so it leads to cell degradation. Right? That's what's happening. Yeah, amphotericin B helps the facilitation of isolating viruses. What that means is it helps facilitate in cellular breakdown. Gentamicin. Our data revealed that gentamicin has a significant cytotoxic and adverse effect on the cell viability. Again, same thing. It facilitates in cellular degradation. And they're adding this to monkey kidney cells typically, sometimes embryo cells or fetal cells. Fetal bovine serum. This one's really messed up. Fetal bovine serum is a common component of animal cell culture media. It is harvested from bovine fetuses taken from pregnant cows during slaughter. FBS is commonly harvested by means of a cardiac puncture without any form of anesthesia. Fetuses are probably exposed to pain and/or discomfort, so the current practice of fetal bovine harvesting is inhumane. Like we talk about like dark rituals, like that sounds like one to me. Okay, so they do all those things, right? And then they prepare the sample for electron microscopy, and then they produce these electron micrograph images, of which we've seen shared all over the world. So a biologist by the name of Harold Hillman has published, unfortunately I think Harold Hillman has passed away, but he's published many critiques of modern cell biology, showing that it's all based in unproven assumptions. So when a tissue is prepared for electron microscopy, an animal is killed, the tissue is excised, it is fixed, frozen, embedded, sectioned, rehydrated, stained, mounted, radiated by light, or bombarded by electron beams. If I were to do that to any of you sitting in this room, would you look like you did before? No, absolutely not. So when we have any electron micrograph images of any biological samples, it produces an unknown number of what's called artifacts, meaning what we're looking at, we don't know that it actually looks like that in nature because we've already done all this stuff to it. So we're looking at an artifact of what may be something. We don't know if this is an artifact of the preparation process for electron microscopy itself. So any of these electron micrograph images that we see, we cannot trust them. Absolutely not. I mean, and then think about the thought that you can excise tissue from a complex physical, emotional, chemical, spiritual, electric, biological being, throw a bunch of stuff in it, and then assume that that tells you anything about what's happening in the human body. It's absurd. It's cringe. I like you. You're going to be on this stage in like 3 years. Okay, and then the other problem with that, appearances can be deceiving. So this was published in Kidney 360. We have observed morphologically indistinguishable inclusions within podocytes and tubular epithelial cells, both in patients negative for coronavirus disease 2019, as well as in renal biopsies from the pre-COVID-19 era. Essentially what that's saying is that they are observing morphologically indistinguishable particles from what virologists refer to as SARS-CoV-2 to these renal biopsies in people prior to the COVID era and people during the COVID era who tested negative, which means nothing. There's no such thing as a false positive. It's just false. It's scientifically and diagnostically meaningless, the tests. And that's not the only one. Electron microscope